She started screaming, "Stop." And I said, "What, Sabrina? What's going on?" She said, "He's trying to kill me." So I pulled off the road, tried to hold her and tell her everything was okay. We made it home, but she came in the house screaming. The man was following her everywhere, and he was trying to choke her.
Sabrina was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now 14, she has been struggling for 2 years to stay in touch with reality. She still hears threatening voices, and hallucinations haunt her waking hours.
Sabrina often sees a black hooded dressed figure that sometimes will just stare at her, sometimes it talks to her, sometimes it tries to touch her, sometimes it tries to kill her. Sometimes when she's struggling with this, they begin almost chanting, "Kill yourself, do it, do it, do it."
Come on in.
All right.
Have a seat.
At the University of North Carolina, researchers are investigating how hallucinations can overwhelm the adolescent brain, and they are testing new drugs to help treat these psychotic symptoms.
Could you look right at that keyhole over there? I'm going to check your eyes out, if that's okay. You just look
Isaac
straight
Wallace
ahead.
began to hear voices when he first went off to college. As the voices grew more frightening and his thoughts more paranoid, he was finally hospitalized for his own protection.
When Isaac walked in the hospital, he was completely wrapped up in hallucinatory experiences he was having, the voices he was hearing, the beliefs he had developed to explain the voices.
Whenever I'd hear voices, I just completely block out what was in the real world and just think about what the voices were saying and talk to them.
The voices that Isaac heard were disturbing because they appeared so real. Yet they were produced by his own flawed brain.
When you see psychosis, you realize that we don't hear with our ears. We hear with our brain. We don't see with our eyes. We see with our brain. And so when the brain misfires, you can have experiences of hearing voices that sound just like they're coming from outside your head.
In the normal brain, waves of sound falling on the ear travel as electrical and chemical pulses to the hearing part of the brain, the auditory cortex, generating a surge of signals that travel to the thinking regions of the brain where they are interpreted. Scientists believe that in psychosis, the thinking regions fail. Neurons misfire in random and chaotic ways, creating sounds that have no connection to the outside world. The result? A perception of sounds that do not exist.
So when the brain misfires, when the circuitry in your brain is out of whack, it will be just as if you're hearing the radio on.
Scientists theorize that psychosis is caused in part by problems with a chemical in the brain called dopamine, one of the brain's neurotransmitters, molecules that send messages from cell to cell across a tiny gap, the synapse. In the normal brain, dopamine acts by stimulating receptors on the neuron that is its target, setting off a cascade of electrical and chemical reactions. In the psychotic brain, for reasons that scientists are still trying to understand, the levels of dopamine surge, overstimulating the receptors, wreaking havoc with the brain's ability to send clear and accurate signals. Since the 1950s, antipsychotic medications have been standard treatment for relieving psychosis. For Isaac, they have worked wonders.
I'd say within 3 weeks, the voices really, they dropped maybe in half to maybe 75% less than what I was hearing. Yeah, it has brought me out of, my own little world and, brought me back into reality. I can hold a job now, and I think I can go back to school as well because my memory's back and my concentration is back. I think I might do better than I did before.
Antipsychotic medications relieve psychosis by reducing the impact of dopamine on the neuron by clogging dopamine-sensitive receptors. With diminished neuronal stimulation, psychotic symptoms lessen and often disappear.
You know, we were lucky. We found the right medicine for Isaac. And at this point, I think he's had a almost complete recovery. He's back to his old self, his old Isaac.
Antipsychotic medications don't cure schizophrenia, and Isaac will need to take them for the rest of his life. But in some people, the drugs don't work at all. Schizophrenia varies from person to person, and Sabrina has a more resistant form of the disease.
When Sabrina first became seriously sick 2 years ago, it seemed like we had 100 possible medicines to try, and certainly one of them would work. And yet, we discover that they haven't worked, and it's getting very scary because we don't have many left. And as a parent, it's incredibly difficult to watch your child suffer. But it's also, I see her courage, I really do. I see her fighting this every day, and I'm incredibly proud of her.
I'll remember it later. That's who taught me. It was my dad, and it was...
For Courtney, medications have helped him pull back from the emotional void he once faced. His thoughts of suicide have passed. He still struggles with his illness, but he is going on with his life and has recently entered college.
I'd rather have lived the life that I live right now, as confusing and painful as it has been, than to have never been born at all.
I think he has learned a lot about how fragile life is. I think he has learned a lot about what is really important.
Every year, 300,000 Americans are diagnosed with schizophrenia. Most of them first develop symptoms in their late teens. But millions more teenagers are vulnerable to another danger. Adolescence is a time of growing independence. As the prefrontal cortex matures, teenagers are beginning to explore the world on their own. But their judgment and reasoning are still not fully developed, which makes it especially risky when they experiment with addictive drugs and alcohol. 12.5 million American teenagers suffer from serious drug abuse problems or addiction.
Adolescence is a time when kids are exposed to all kinds of influences in the world, some of them terribly negative, like drugs of abuse. Addiction is a disease of the brain that affects thinking, emotion, and behavior. In that sense, it's like many other serious brain diseases, like depression, like schizophrenia. Only here, the pathogen are the drugs of abuse themselves, acting on a vulnerable brain.
I never thought that I would become an addict, or even thought about being an addict, until I really started doing coke. And then it kind of dawned on me, I'm doing cocaine now. It's not just weed, it's not just alcohol, you know. This is getting worse and worse.
Jessie Galatar began experimenting with alcohol when she was 11. Marijuana followed shortly after, and then an array of other addictive drugs. By 16, she was addicted to cocaine.
She had to have it to function. She had to have it to get out of bed. She couldn't get out of bed without doing cocaine first. She couldn't walk into the school without having done cocaine in the parking lot. And it wasn't fun anymore. It was just, she had to do it to live.
I was just like, I've got to do something right now or I'm gonna die. Because I couldn't live like that anymore.
By 17, caught in a desperate obsession, Jessie checked into the Karen Foundation in eastern Pennsylvania.